So I have really exciting news. I've been finally moved into my new apartment.
Spotlights don't just reveal beauty. Sometimes, they hide something far more dangerous beneath the surface. One moment, she's posing for glamorous photos, stepping into elite circles, blending effortlessly with wealth and power. And the next, she's at the center of a criminal case that's leaving even seasoned investigators stunned. Behind the designer outfits and carefully crafted charm, prosecutors believe there was a calculated game unfolding, one built on trust, deception, and perfectly timed moves. As the allegations begin to stack up, what once looked like a dream life starts to unravel into something far darker, exposing a story that feels less like reality and more like a perfectly executed scheme. What makes this case so unsettling isn't just the allegations, it's how effortlessly everything seemed to fall into place. According to investigators, this wasn't random, messy crime. It followed a pattern, a very calculated one. At the center of it all is Adva Levie, a 28-year-old former model who also went by the name Mia Ventura. On the surface, her life looked polished and aspirational. Magazine features, luxury environments, and access to elite social circles. But prosecutors now allege that behind that image was a carefully constructed strategy designed to exploit one very specific thing: trust. Authorities claim that between 2023 and 2025, Levie used dating apps as her entry point. Not just casually, but intentionally. The targets, according to the Los Angeles County District Attorney's Office, were often wealthy, older men, and in some cases, younger women. The locations weren't random either. Places like West Hollywood, Beverly Hills, and Westlake Village. Affluent areas, high-value environments, and that's where the pattern begins. The allegation is that she would build a connection first, not rushed, not obvious. Conversations, chemistry, familiarity, the kind of interaction that lowers defenses, the kind that makes someone comfortable enough to open their personal space. Because once that door opened, literally, that's when things allegedly shifted. Prosecutors say Levie gained access to victims' homes by presenting herself as a romantic partner, or even a travel companion. Someone trusted, someone welcomed. And once inside, that trust became the vulnerability. Cash, jewelry, designer items, high-end valuables, gone. Now here's where it gets more serious from a legal standpoint. She's currently facing 6 felony charges, including grand theft, unauthorized use of personal identifying information, and first-degree residential burglary. One of those burglary charges includes the enhancement of a person being present inside the home, something that significantly raises the stakes. According to District Attorney Nathan Hochman, the prosecution believes they can prove that this wasn't coincidence or misunderstanding. The claim is that Levie intentionally built relationships with the goal of gaining access, and ultimately, stealing. If convicted on all counts, she could be looking at up to 11 years and 8 months in state prison. But here's where the case becomes even more layered. She has pleaded not guilty. That single decision shifts everything. Because now, this isn't just about accusations, it's about proof, evidence, intent, and whether prosecutors can connect all the dots beyond a reasonable doubt. At the moment, Levie is not in custody. She's been released with an ankle monitor and ordered to stay away from alleged victims. Her arraignment is scheduled at a Los Angeles courthouse, where the formal legal battle will begin to take shape. But this story doesn't stay confined to California. Reports suggest similar complaints have surfaced in multiple locations, including Nevada, Florida, and even internationally in countries like France and Italy. While those reports vary in detail and status, they add a broader dimension to the narrative, one that prosecutors may or may not attempt to introduce depending on admissibility and relevance. Still, it paints a picture that investigators are clearly paying attention to. And then there are the first-hand accounts. One of the most talked about incidents comes from Michael Sartain, a podcast host who publicly described an encounter that feels almost cinematic in how it unfolded. According to him, Levie appeared as a guest on his show. At some point during filming, she stepped into a green room where several female panelists had left their belongings. What allegedly happened next is what caught attention. Sartain claims that while everyone else was occupied, Levie went through the purses in that room and took credit cards and cash, then calmly returned to sit on the panel, continuing the discussion as if nothing had happened. No panic, no urgency, just composure. He described her demeanor as cool as a cucumber. And that detail matters. Because in cases like this, behavior becomes part of the narrative. Not just what was allegedly done, but how it was done. Another alleged victim told local media that after her credit card was taken, it was used to attempt multiple purchases, including an expensive appointment at a Beverly Hills salon. That same victim says she later discovered the booking had been made under the name Mia Ventura. That alias keeps showing up. Then there's the account from Amber Karis Bassick, who shared a very different kind of experience. According to her, Levie invited her on what was described as an all-expenses-paid trip to Ibiza, a glamorous getaway, content creation, a girls' trip. Except when she arrived, nothing had been paid. She reportedly had to cover more than $2,000 just to check into the hotel. And it didn't stop there. Bassick claims that when Levie eventually arrived, she was being followed by a taxi driver demanding payment, another expense that fell onto her. The explanation? Allegedly, Levie said her American Express card wasn't working in Europe. From there, the situation became even more unusual. Bassick claims their nights were spent seeking out wealthy older men to fund dinners, drinks, and experiences. She also alleged that Levie would take photos of men's credit cards during these interactions. According to her, what she thought was a content trip turned into something else entirely, a setup to attract potential targets. Now, it's important to emphasize, these are allegations, individual accounts. They will ultimately need to be tested in court, examined, challenged, and either supported or dismantled through evidence. Because in the legal system, patterns alone aren't enough. Intent has to be proven. And that's where this case becomes particularly complex. For a charge like residential burglary, prosecutors must show that the intent to steal existed before entry, not after. Not as a spontaneous decision, before stepping inside. That distinction may sound technical, but it's critical. Because if the defense can argue that any alleged theft was an afterthought, rather than premeditated, it could significantly impact how certain charges are applied. At the same time, multiple alleged victims telling similar stories can strengthen the prosecution's argument. Not individually, but collectively. Patterns can suggest intent, but they still have to meet the legal threshold. And then there's the digital trail. In cases involving credit cards, personal identifying information, and online interactions, evidence often extends beyond physical testimony. Transaction records, timestamps, app communications, IP data, all of it can potentially be reconstructed. If prosecutors have access to that kind of data, it could either reinforce their claims or leave gaps that the defense can exploit. Meanwhile, Levie herself has responded at least partially. In a reported phone conversation with media, she suggested that powerful individuals might be behind the accusations, implying that upsetting the wrong people can have consequences. But when pressed for details, she reportedly ended the conversation, which leaves everything in a kind of tension. On one side, a prosecution building a case around a pattern of calculated deception. On the other, a defendant denying the allegations and hinting at a different narrative entirely. And somewhere in between, that gray area where evidence, perception, and reality collide, is where this case will ultimately be decided. Because when charm, access, and alleged manipulation intersect like this, the story stops being simple and starts becoming something much harder to untangle. As this case moves closer to court, the real battle shifts away from headlines and into something far more precise: legal strategy. Because at this level, it's no longer about what sounds convincing, it's about what can actually be proven, line by line, under scrutiny. And one of the most critical elements here is something most people don't immediately think about: intent. In criminal law, especially in California, intent isn't just a supporting detail, it's often the backbone of the entire charge. Take first-degree residential burglary, for example. Prosecutors don't just need to show that something was taken, they need to establish that the intent to commit theft existed before entering the property. Not during, not after, before that threshold was ever crossed. That's a very high bar. Because if the defense can introduce reasonable doubt, if they can suggest that any alleged theft was impulsive, opportunistic, or even misunderstood, then one of the most serious charges in this case starts to weaken. Not disappear entirely, but shift. And in law, even a small shift can have massive consequences. Now consider how prosecutors might respond. When you have multiple alleged victims describing similar experiences, that's where patterns come into play. Individually, each story may be questioned, but collectively they can start to form a narrative, one that suggests planning rather than coincidence. That's how intent is often built in cases like this. Not from a single moment, but from repetition. And this is exactly why the number of allegations matters. If different individuals with no direct connection to each other describe nearly identical setups, meeting through apps, gaining trust, entering private spaces, and then valuables going missing, that consistency becomes powerful. It's circumstantial, yes, but in many cases, circumstantial evidence is what carries the argument forward. At the same time, the defense has its own pathways. One possible strategy is reframing the relationships themselves. Dating apps, by nature, involve meeting strangers, forming quick connections, and sometimes entering personal environments early on. The defense could argue that these were consensual interactions that simply didn't end well, that gifts, expenses, or shared costs are being reinterpreted after the fact. It wouldn't be the first time a case hinged on perception, because in situations involving social dynamics, especially ones tied to wealth, attraction, and lifestyle, the line between generosity and exploitation can become blurred. What one person sees as manipulation, another might interpret as mutual benefit. That ambiguity is something defense attorneys are trained to leverage. And then there's the issue of evidence. In modern cases like this, digital footprints often play a central role. Credit card transactions, timestamps, location data, app messages. These aren't just background details. They can establish timelines with surprising precision. For example, if a stolen credit card is used shortly after a meeting, investigators can track where and when that transaction occurred. Surveillance footage from stores, salons, or hotels can potentially place a person at a specific location. Even rideshare records or phone GPS data can contribute to reconstructing movements. But here's the key point. Data alone doesn't explain intent. It can show what happened. It can even show when and where. But the why, the intent behind those actions, is still something that has to be argued, interpreted, and ultimately believed by a jury. That's where testimony becomes critical. And testimony by nature is unpredictable. Witness credibility, consistency, demeanor under questioning. All of these factors influence how a jury perceives the story. A confident, composed witness can be persuasive, but under cross-examination, even small inconsistencies can create doubt. Now imagine that multiplied across multiple alleged victims. Each one strengthens the prosecution's case, but also introduces more variables, more opportunities for the defense to identify contradictions, memory gaps, or alternative explanations. It becomes a balancing act, volume versus precision. Another layer that cannot be ignored is identity. The use of an alias, Mia Ventura, appears repeatedly in these allegations. From booking appointments to interacting socially, that name becomes a focal point. Prosecutors may argue that using an alternate identity supports an intent to deceive. But again, the defense could counter. In industries like modeling, entertainment, and online content creation, stage names are not unusual. They're often part of branding. So the question becomes, was the alias used for professional reasons or as a tool for fraud? That distinction matters more than it seems, because if the alias can be normalized within the context of her career, it weakens its impact as evidence of deception. But if prosecutors can tie that name directly to fraudulent transactions or misrepresentation, it becomes far more damaging. Then there's the financial aspect. High-value items, cash, gold, designer goods, are central to the allegations. These aren't minor losses. They represent significant economic impact, which can influence how seriously the case is treated. But financial crimes also introduce another legal complication: tracing. Where did the items go? Were they recovered? Were they sold, transferred, or used in identifiable ways? If prosecutors can trace stolen assets directly back to the defendant, that creates a stronger evidentiary chain. But if those items are missing, unaccounted for, or indirectly linked, it opens the door for alternative explanations. And in criminal law, alternative explanations, even unlikely ones, can be enough to create reasonable doubt. Now, beyond the courtroom strategies, there's another factor quietly shaping this case: optics. Not legally, but psychologically. Cases like this often attract attention because they intersect with themes people already feel strongly about: wealth, attraction, trust, manipulation. Jurors, despite instructions to remain impartial, are still human. And that can subtly influence how evidence is perceived. For example, the idea of someone using charm and social access to commit crimes challenges expectations. It doesn't fit the traditional image of criminal behavior. And when something doesn't fit expectations, people tend to either scrutinize it more or believe it more strongly. It can go both ways. That's why jury selection becomes so critical. Attorneys on both sides will carefully evaluate potential jurors, looking for biases, assumptions, or prior exposure to similar cases. The goal isn't to find perfect neutrality, that's nearly impossible, but to assemble a group capable of evaluating evidence without having already decided the outcome. And even that process is strategic, because a single strongly opinionated juror can shift deliberations dramatically. In some cases, it only takes one person to hold out, question the narrative, or push for deeper analysis. Meanwhile, outside the courtroom, the narrative continues to evolve. Media coverage, public speculation, and social discussions all contribute to shaping perception. While jurors are instructed to avoid external information, the reality is that high-profile cases often carry a kind of ambient awareness. People hear things, they form impressions, and those impressions don't just disappear. At the center of all of this remains Adva Levie, a figure whose identity now exists in two completely different versions. One version is the public image: model, traveler, someone navigating high-end spaces with ease. The other is the version described by prosecutors: calculated, strategic, exploiting emotional and social dynamics for personal gain. The courtroom is where those two versions will collide, and when they do, everything will come down to clarity. Not speculation, not assumptions, but what can be demonstrated, supported, and ultimately believed beyond a reasonable doubt. Because in the end, cases like this aren't decided by how compelling the story sounds. They're decided by how solid the proof actually is. And right now, that proof is what everyone is waiting to see. As the case edges closer to trial, everything begins to narrow into one decisive question. Not what people think happened, but what can actually survive the pressure of a courtroom. Because once proceedings begin, every claim, every statement, every assumption is dissected with precision. And this is where cases like this often take unexpected turns. On paper, the prosecution's theory appears structured: multiple alleged victims, similar patterns, financial losses, and a timeline that stretches across different locations. But inside a courtroom, structure alone isn't enough. Each piece has to connect cleanly, without gaps, without contradictions, and without leaving room for reasonable doubt. That's especially true when dealing with a case built heavily on circumstantial evidence. Because while circumstantial evidence can be powerful, it also depends on interpretation. A sequence of events might look like a deliberate plan, or it might be framed as coincidence, misunderstanding, or poor judgment. The difference lies entirely in how convincingly each side presents that narrative. And that brings us to one of the most unpredictable elements of any trial: the human factor. Jurors don't just evaluate facts, they interpret behavior. How someone speaks, reacts, maintains composure under pressure. All of it contributes to perception. A calm demeanor can be seen as confidence, or as calculated control. Emotional responses can signal sincerity, or be viewed as performative. There's no fixed formula, which makes outcomes far less predictable than most people expect. Now, if this case does proceed fully to trial, the prosecution will likely lean heavily on consistency. The idea that multiple individuals, independent of each other, experienced similar situations isn't just persuasive, it creates a pattern that's difficult to ignore. But the defense doesn't need to disprove every allegation. They only need to introduce doubt. And doubt doesn't require an alternative story to be perfect, it just needs to be plausible. That's a critical distinction. If even one juror begins to question whether the events unfolded exactly as described, the entire dynamic of deliberation can shift. Then there's the matter of credibility. Every alleged victim who takes the stand adds weight to the case, but also introduces vulnerability. Cross-examination is designed to test memory, consistency, and reliability. Even small discrepancies can be magnified. Timelines can be challenged. Motives can be questioned. And in a case involving social interactions, dating, travel, shared experiences, those gray areas become even more pronounced. For example, financial exchanges. What one person considers theft, another might describe as a misunderstanding over shared expenses. What appears to be manipulation could be framed as mutual arrangement. These aren't just hypothetical defenses, they're common strategies in cases where relationships are involved. And that's exactly what makes this situation so complex. Because it sits at the intersection of personal relationships and criminal allegations. Now layer on top of that the international dimension. Reports suggesting similar incidents in places like Europe introduce an entirely different level of complexity. Not necessarily in terms of charges, but in narrative. If prosecutors attempt to introduce patterns beyond California, they'll have to navigate strict evidentiary rules. What's admissible, what's relevant, and what might unfairly prejudice a jury. The defense, of course, would push back strongly against anything that feels like character assassination rather than direct evidence. Because ultimately, this trial isn't about reputation, it's about proof. Another critical factor here is the potential for a plea deal. Cases involving multiple counts, especially felonies, often come with negotiation behind the scenes. Prosecutors may offer reduced charges or sentencing recommendations in exchange for a guilty plea. From their perspective, it guarantees accountability without the uncertainty of trial. From the defense perspective, it becomes a calculation: risk versus outcome. Go to trial, and there's a chance of acquittal, but also the risk of maximum sentencing. Accept a deal, and the outcome becomes more predictable, but at the cost of admitting guilt. In this particular situation, there's an added layer that could influence that decision significantly: immigration consequences. Legal experts have pointed out that certain felony convictions, especially those categorized as aggravated, can trigger deportation under federal law. That means the stakes go beyond prison time. They extend into long-term residency, future opportunities, and the ability to remain in the country at all. So any negotiation isn't just about years or months, it's about life trajectory. And that's why defense strategy becomes incredibly nuanced. It's not just about winning the case, it's about minimizing irreversible consequences. Meanwhile, the prosecution faces its own challenges. High-profile cases often come with expectations, public interest, media coverage. But none of that translates into legal advantage. In fact, it can sometimes create additional pressure to ensure that every step is airtight. Because if a case like this collapses due to weak evidence or procedural issues, it doesn't just affect the outcome, it affects credibility. And credibility, for both sides, is everything. At the center of it all remains Adva Levie, whose story now exists in a state of suspension. Not proven, not dismissed. Waiting. Waiting for evidence to be presented. Waiting for arguments to be tested. Waiting for a group of jurors to sit down, review everything, and decide which version of events holds up under scrutiny. Because once that process begins, narratives lose their power. Only facts remain. And even then, those facts must be interpreted, weighed, and agreed upon unanimously. That's the standard. Not majority, not probability, certainty, beyond a reasonable doubt. Until that moment arrives, everything else remains speculation. The headlines, the interviews, the allegations, they all exist outside the one place where it truly matters: the courtroom. And that's what makes this case so compelling. Not just the accusations, not just the personalities involved, but the uncertainty of how it will all unfold once the legal system does what it's designed to do: strip everything down to evidence and force a conclusion. Because in stories like this, the ending isn't written by public opinion. It's decided by proof. And if you've made it this far, you already know. This isn't the kind of case you can look away from halfway. Every detail adds another layer, and every layer raises new questions about what really happened behind closed doors. So if you want more deep dives like this, where we break down real cases step by step without the noise, make sure you hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and share this with someone who's just as hooked on true crime as you are. And here's something I want you to think about. When patterns start repeating across different people and places, do you see that as undeniable proof? Or is there still room for coincidence? Drop your thoughts in the comments. I'll be reading.